That's one thing that I asked Jill about yesterday. So I think you're hopefully going to talk about that. And then anything else that you've been hearing in testimony that you would like to respond to, we're still trying to sort things out. So,
Okay.
and I know we slotted it for half an hour. If we run a little long, I think that's okay if the next folks would be okay with that.
Good morning. My name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department. So we work directly with municipalities to administer everything related to the statewide education property tax system and billing. We do have a team of individuals who also oversee the current use program. So yeah, we've certainly been following along. We do definitely see some places where we'd love to see some changes or improvements to the program, but it's always, I just exercise extreme caution about current use because it's one of those things where if you change something here, then you might not have thought through all the different threads. So I say that in the context of I am very much interested in what the NRC put together. Anything that we can have that's some sort of a formula that individuals can make informed decisions on is helpful. I haven't honestly had a moment to even like run a few scenarios through to see what the result is. So I would ask for a little more time. And maybe it's as simple as like, we could talk about this through the rest of this session or something, but I genuinely would want to run through some different scenarios before I just say, yep, this is the right thing and all full speed ahead. But just as a reminder for sort of the broader context, the land use change tax right now is 10% of the value of the enrolled acreage. And farm buildings, of course, are zero if they're enrolled in the program as well. And if it's withdrawing a portion of the enrolled parcel, which there's a fair amount of that, then it requires the local lister to value that withdrawn acreage as a standalone parcel. And so that's sort of the crux of the nut we're trying to crack here, is the idea being that you want that to have some weight. You want that if you're breaking off a piece or removing land from the program, that there's a land use change tax penalty. In practice, it makes it it's challenging for us to get that back from the listers in a timely fashion. It's created a lot of challenges for landowners. They have no idea of what that land use change tax will be until it's valued at the point it's removed from the program. So it's sort of a chicken and egg challenge. You've heard from witnesses who have experienced very sort of real world implications of when you're changing hands of property and the land use change tax is sort of part of that package deal, it follows the lien and it follows the land. And so it creates this sort of, it's created a lot of consternation for folks because depending on if they agree before closing on who's paying the land use change tax, or if the closing happens and then now you've got the hot potato, you've got to pay the land use change tax. There are challenges with that. So it would be great to have something that at a point in time, or that we could at the tax department have a formula that at least gives folks an estimate of what their land use change tax would be. So it is very possible. And I'm sure folks know Deb Brighton's reputation precedes her. She has been a long-standing, well-respected financial person in state of Vermont education funding. So I have a great deal of respect and deference to her, like work behind the scenes to come up with some sort of a formula. I just think we need more time to actually sort of like run through some scenarios we actually have to see what that looks like. But it does seem like it's a step in the right direction of giving us something concrete that landowners can make decisions on and know what the penalty is going to be before they commit to changing their land.
I think that it's probably safe to say, so I mean, reality check, we're 2 days away, plus a day and a half away from the crossover deadline. We're not going to, we could spend the next 36 hours with you sitting here if you had the time looking at, scenarios and trying to map that out. So, and I don't think that's what we are aiming to do either by tomorrow or by the end of the session or anytime. But would it make sense for us to think about giving the board the authority to consider either that specific proposal or something like it, which I think right now you don't have that authority, that the statute says it needs to be
a local assessing.
The assessor needs to do it. Yeah. Um, so, I mean, just putting that out there as
Okay.
maybe another way to think about it.
I think in the little bit of time I've had to sort of contemplate what we could do, I think it might, at a minimum, maybe PVR could do a stronger job of sort of supporting the listers and making this valuation. That's something we could do like tomorrow, right? And maybe some sort of a framework like what VNRC has proposed could be something we give to the lister and say, use this. But yeah, right now the current use advisory board authority is about setting those use values every year. And we do have an administrative rulemaking authority. But the land use change tax is sort of a different beast because it's not really a tax, it's a penalty. And right now it's completely dependent on the grand list valuation, whether it's the entire enrolled acreage or not. And so that would be a pretty significant change. We'd want to just run through what that literally could look like. So, and also the current construct pays the municipalities part of the land use change tax that's collected. So that would be another component of this to look into. But I think more broadly speaking, there's like some sort of competing priorities or like different gears are changing and doing different things. So I think it's just sort of like fundamentally stepping back. Does the committee want to incentivize smaller, smarter withdrawals for residential purposes, in which case that might be a different policy lever than if you're trying to, right now, the construct is if you create a parcel less than 25 acres, that's considered development in the land use change tax. So it's almost like that 25 acre development trigger is actually sort of a nut that's part of a lot of these things that trying to change. And that might be worth exploring rather than, the penalty, because it's human behavior, right? It's at some point, it's hard to say exactly what happened, but it feels like we're trying to sort of change different pieces when it might actually be fundamentally that the concern is we want to be able to allow people who are currently enrolled in the program to take out smaller pieces so they can leave the rest enrolled and protected in the program for reasonable residential development. And in which case, how do you accomplish that? Right.
So, and I think that is, there may be more than one. So that is, I think what you just articulated is one goal perhaps. And that is maybe the goal that was in the minds of folks who introduced 134. And it's only in talking about that bill and the others that a couple of other things have surfaced, one of which is this issue that buyers and sellers face when they don't know what the penalty is going to be. And that listers are caught up in when we know, just those of us who have ever had a conversation with a lister or somebody who knows a lister, that there's fewer and fewer listers and they have a lot of work to do right now. Reappraisals are happening all over and they're going to continue to be happening. So anyway, so that's maybe a separate issue. And then maybe a third issue is the one that we've heard about and that you alluded to, where somebody is continuing to use the land for ag purposes, but is less than 25 acres. So there was a subdivision. It's not being developed and there's no intention to develop it. It developed in the sense of building.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's only going to continue to happen, right? Like we only have so many acres in Vermont and we only have so many landowners in Vermont. We only have so many farmers in Vermont. So it does make sense, there are going to continue to be those sort of smaller acreage size transactions. And what is the will of the committee what do we want to incentivize or not incentivize? I did want to add one thing about 134 and the housing. I think Kirby Keaton, Ledge Council, and I talked about this quickly last night. It struck me that it might really be more of an abatement of the land use change tax rather than exemption on the front, because right now you can have enrolled acreage and you can withdraw any portion of that, right? The land use change tax is calculated, but it's not due until you develop or remove it or want to remove the lien. So there's a lot of land that's withdrawn but not developed. Those folks are paying the full property tax on there. The lien is still kind of hanging out there. So one of the concerns we had about trying to administer 134 as it's currently written was like, how would we know about affordable housing? This is assuming something that would happen in the future. So could it be that it's withdrawn from the program, the lien is there just like it is now under that current construct? And then there are very few abatement opportunities at the other end. But if the goal of the legislature is to not impose the land use change tax if it meets these certain housing requirements, which I am not an expert in what those regulations would be, but whether it's affordable housing capital A or not, that if that was demonstrated by some sort of a certification from some sort of an entity, right, like ACCD or whomever, that might be another way to write that language, that the land use change tax would be abated rather than try to exempt it before something has happened. Because then someone could theoretically do anything, or it might be 10 years sitting there without actually, there's lots of reasons why affordable housing things may not happen.
Yeah.
And so for us to try to keep track of who's exempted, and then what if they end up not doing that, then we're then imposing the LUC. So that was a way I thought we might.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that doing something along those lines has come up a couple of times, and yeah. Representative Mills.
Thank you. So you mentioned residential housing, and this bill was kind of made for that residential. We also use the term suitable workforce housing, which I guess it'd be better off to. And then was it Kirby yesterday? It said, don't make a new category of housing. We have certain definitions already, and perhaps residential is the. And when you think about residential, you think residential in Derby looks different than residential in South Burlington, looks different than residential in Alberg. There's all different thoughts,
Right. I don't know that, I think it would need to be something that some authority would determine is eligible for the abatement.
Yeah.
I don't know who that necessarily is. It could certainly be that it's, on the residential, unless it says residential, but that might be far broader than what you folks are contemplating. Something immediate that might be helpful though, is if it's being withdrawn to create farm employee housing. Right now, they have to pull it out and pay the land use change tax. And then for 12 months, it's got to be used as employee housing. And then it can go back in the program. That might be that's an example of like, it could be abated if after a year it's being used. There are things like that farmers might find helpful. Again, I would think you folks would want to hear from them, but there's housing is obviously, there's so many definitions. I wouldn't feel comfortable in a current use bill telling you all what that definition could be, because it might be far broader than what you're thinking. But it sounds like affordable housing under Title 10 is narrower than what you might be wanting to.
That is.
So again, I think it might come back to the acreage. If the idea is to have sort of smart development that has a minimal impact on the current use, then maybe is how do you incentivize smaller parcels? I've heard you mention, the 5 acre, 10 acre sort of estate is not what you folks are looking to create. So is it, a maximum acreage, and above that, it's a higher penalty? I don't know. There's ways to slice that, but it comes back to kind of what's the behavior you're trying to reward or incentivize without blowing it all wide open. Because I don't know what else folks are using land they're pulling out, if not for hopefully housing.
Did you have other thoughts, Jill?
I know I've certainly also been following the discussion about the 25% income and the equine. We don't have a position on those. I think it's pretty compelling, but I don't know how to get a fiscal estimate on what the impact would be. Obviously, if you reduce that threshold, you're that would have some fiscal impact. But again, I think what it actually is trying to get at is the farm building use meeting that threshold, and the under 25 acre. So I do think you could get the development under 25 acres, or look at the income for the farm buildings specifically, if that's what the committee is trying to incentivize. So that was not helpful, but that's, it's all churning around, but
So, let me, I think you might be helpful, though, on thinking about this. I'll give you a chance to be helpful. So a minute ago, we were talking about, maybe there are three different things that we're trying to do, and actually this is something else, I think. It's saying right now, there are people who are farming. We might look at it and say, oh, they're doing some farming in this stuff, but they don't qualify because they don't either have the income level or it's under 25 acres and they don't meet one of those criteria. But I think we have wondered, though, how many people might be actually, how many more people would it bring in to lower it from 50 to 25, given that there's already a fairly modest $2,000 is, maybe that's not modest, but it seems like it wouldn't be all that difficult to achieve that over the course of a year. So the department tracks, at least when people enroll the first time, which category you fall into?
yes, yep. And we, and this conversation led to a really good conversation back at the office with staff about like what they see and who. So we are able to look at federal tax returns. I think it's Schedule F. People might be listing their income. It does seem like 50% of your gross income is a higher bar than it ever was because people are having, multiple jobs, or it includes your spouse, or it doesn't, or things like that. So again, that is applied for the farm building or the under 25 acres. The $2,000 for the sale of farm crops is a much largely a lower bar. There's certainly reasons why that wouldn't be. If you're just bartering your hay for something else, that's not really $2,000 worth of farm crops. But again, it comes back to that bar is set much higher for the under 25 acres and farm buildings. So is it actually about the income or is it about the acreage? But I think you're right. I think there's probably a lot of folks. And when I asked staff if I could come back here and say, how many people have we denied because they didn't meet that 50% gross income? Only 2. But the reason is because we then work with them. They might be able to enroll their farm building, but not their acreage, or vice versa, right? We try to get, okay, what can be enrolled? What can be met? Because that's sort of part of the process. It's a conversation. So I think you're right. It might not have as large of an impact, which is scary for me to say as someone who like watches the Ed Fund as well. But like, it's a high bar, and there's still the $22,000 from the sale of farm crops. That is very different. So like, if you folks saw like actual examples of both of these things, I think you'd be a little surprised. There could be a very much working farm under 25 acres that meets this bar. And then you might have like what some of us might consider really lovely place with lots of amenities that meets the $2,000 for the sale farm crop, right? So that's just the nature of current use. We're never going to get around it. But if the 25 acre threshold has a much higher bar, then maybe that acreage is what is actually that triggers development is actually what we should all talk about. Sorry, this is just what as I've been watching you all and thinking about it, that seems to be sort of the nut that we're trying to crack.
Representative Burke.
So are you saying that reducing it to 25% of farmers' income doesn't look like it's going to have a great impact on changing the current?
When I first heard it, I thought it really would, but upon further like digging in, and again, I don't want to say unequivocally that it would or would not, but if you think about the there are components of the current use program that are already under that for other reasons. I don't think it would be quite as extreme as it might have seemed when that first came up.
You said you asked or looked into it, and there'd only been 2. Is that over the course of?
Denied because of income, because we try to work with them to qualify other ways or qualify what portions we can get to qualify. Another thing, right? So there's a lot of current use administrative stuff happening right now, but regarding like trusts and things like that. So putting your land into a trust or an LLC, things like that. So that's actually, we see a lot of that. And so there are ways to remove, like if your spouse has income that's now being counted as part of that 50% gross, you can own the property or lease the property as an individual, and then that can raise that bar to 50% as like a way to sort of like articulate. Now, I really am making 50% of my gross income from farming. Like there are but it's complicated and it's not ideal. And again, I think it might be a pretty high bar for that under 25 acres.
Just so that we're clear, is that 2 in the past 12 months or 2?
Yeah, for 2024.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that doesn't come up a lot. I think some people, and again, this was the other sort of caveat for my staff. It might be that folks call us. A lot of times they're on the phone all day, every day answering, because for every current use enrollment, there's a new, like there no two is the same, but people will call and ask, well, what if I did this? Or what if I did this? Or I just purchased this property, or I'm thinking about purchasing this property. So we try to sort of help answer those questions before they get to the point that they've applied, they've got maps, they've done all that work, and then deny. That doesn't feel good. So it's a lot more like there's conversations to try to figure out, or to let folks know right off, you know, this doesn't look like you would be eligible.
Yeah.
So I think that's why it's not that only 2 people didn't qualify. I think it's that they either were sort of headed off before they actually applied, or we worked with them to figure out what could be eligible.
Do you have any thoughts on what the scenario that I described where land is divided? There's a parcel that's under 25 acres, it's in ag use, and it's divided and sold, but it stays in ag use. Right now, there's a penalty applied in that situation immediately in its development. Do you have any thoughts on changing that so that the lien stays on as long as it's not built on, but changing the definition of development, I guess, in this?
Right. So in that case, what would need to happen would be the development. So it's very straightforward. The creation of a parcel under 25 acres that's enrolled is development. Like that's very straightforward. And so that's the scenario that you folks heard about. And that happens. You can certainly, when you purchase property that's in the program and you're even if it's under 25, you're purchasing it, it's going to remain in the program, you're remaining eligible, you can transfer it. It's the creation, it's actually literally splitting the parcel, it gets a new span, it's a new parcel that's under that. That is very clear. So that would need to be changed.
Yeah, we've actually looked at the language, I think, or we're having some language developed that would accomplish that. So I think we understand it needs a statutory change, that there's no discussion right now. And I understand that it may be from the department's perspective, that you're happy to apply the statute with whatever the statute is. But if you have thoughts on changing it that you want to share, we can hear those.
Right. So exactly what's the behavior you're trying to either incentivize or disincentivize? Right. So if the current statute's very clear, it is a policy decision that you do not want to break up parcels that are in current use and break them off and sell them. That's kind of how I would read the current statute. So if the policy decision is to allow for parcels smaller than 25 acres to be created, as long as it remains in the program, that would be how you'd want to sort of address that if it was transferred to stay within the program. But if the idea is to try to keep the parcels intact, you would not want to change that regardless. So I think I think there's current language right now that if I did that scenario, if I had 25 acres broken in half and sold it to each of my kids or whatever, if it's an immediate family member, for example, and they're going to continue to use it that way, then the land use change tax isn't necessarily, it's not considered development. But as soon as I put the house on there or something, right, I need a house site, I got to pull it out, it's developed. So yeah, I genuinely can't take like a policy position. Like it's truly what the intent is to incentivize or not.
And I think we understand that, but also appreciate your framing it that way. And I think that right now, as you said, if you divide it and one of your children or a family member takes it, there's no penalty applied. It's still being divided.
As long as it's still eligible, right? As long as it's not
Yes.
being developed. So if
Exactly.
I sell it to my kid and then she continues to farm it as it was before, it's eligible in every other way. She's still a qualified farmer, right?
Okay.
But as soon as you start to, because again, when current use was put in place, this is to like guard against developing up all of our natural resources. So any change you make to that, you want to be really strategic to really be sure you're incentivizing the right.
Representative Boston.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, I mean, the way that our committee heard about this was a situation where the land was maintaining the same type of use, but there was a death, the children sold the property to the farmers that had been working the land. They wanted to continue working the land, but they wanted to own it. And by doing that, there was this extraordinary fee that just about put them out of business. And so, I mean, I would think that our committee's goal would be to keep land in farming. So by changing the statute and making, perhaps the land is not owned by one mega family, it's owned by two other people. To me, that doesn't need to be a problem if it's continuing to be farmland.
Mhm.
And penalizing the farmer that's been working as a tenant for 7 years by saying, oh, now you have to pay a whole bunch of money because you own it. To me, that's a little bit elitist, honestly. It's saying like, we want one big farm, not two small ones, as long as it's still farming. It feels like the policy goals of maintaining farmland are going to be better preserved that way than if they sell it to somebody else. Maybe they are going to build it and build something else on there.
Mhm.
So anyway, I mean, I think it's something we just need to talk about some more.
Yeah, the other example is, that's come up lately is if you are genuinely wanting to keep the vast majority of your land in the program, but you cannot afford to continue to farm, for example. So you're going to sell off a couple acres to try to keep yourself afloat.
Yeah.
And then you get a land use change tax. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how it is, right? That's how it's written right now. I don't disagree.
Well, and that's where, well,
But again, it was creating a separate parcel, and right now if it's creating a parcel under 25 acres, that's the definition of development right now.
I want to just go back to, well, I don't want to cut this conversation off if there were other thoughts of Representative Burke.
I mean, I'll keep going back, I think, to my bill, but you know, if it's 6% rather than 10, that would have been more affordable for that person.
Yeah.
And it would have stayed within the current, we wouldn't be disrupting the system of current use all that much outside of lessening the burden. Right? That's just.
Yeah, but if it's 6% of. When you split off a parcel of land, you know, a big field sells for less per acre than a small piece. That's where I like this gentleman's chart. You know, you evaluate the whole field. And then you take a percentage of that and then you break it down to the 2 acres or 1 acre or 5 acres if you want to build a fancier place. And then that's the penalty that's paid at 10%. And that's something that can be, calculated, bang, and people know where they're heading right off with it. Instead of waiting for the listers to come and then you get a lister doesn't realize that you just split off a piece, but your view is Casella Waste Management at 1.7 nautical miles away.
Jill, I know.
One statute.
I know you already have testified on bills and testified that the department doesn't necessarily have a position on them. Is there anything else that you could say, though, that would help us just think about? So Representative Burt mentioned that one of the bills just reduces the tax from 10 to 6%. Is that right? Yeah. And then in maybe it's 134, and I have to say, I'm sorry, I've lost track of which piece goes with which bill. But there's the changing the land use change check so that it would be straightforward to apply, going back to the way it was some point in the past. It just is a prorated, section and by acreage, by area. So if there's anything you can say that would help us just think about that.
Yeah, and it struck me, I meant to bring up the formula. So I think it's helpful to know at what point the valuations are done. And that's, again, like from my hat, we're trying to make it more administratively easy and more transparent and more predictable. So one of the other benefits of a chart or a formula like the NRC presented is the lister at the time you enroll in current use, it very well may not necessarily be your entire parcel, right? So you have a parcel, you got one span, you're in the grand list, but in current use, it is most likely acreage, and then you have a 2-acre house site, which is the exclusion, or you have portions of your parcel that are excluded for whatever reason. So in order to get to your property tax bill, the lister already is valuing, they're taking that overall grand list value and apportioning it appropriately. So we already have the value of the enrolled acreage calculated. So that's why it's helpful to have some sort of formula, because then the lister has already done the valuation of that enrolled property. And so can we apply the land use change tax in some way to whatever portion is coming out using something we've already done? Whereas right now, if you've got your enrolled acreage, you've got the valuation, but right now we're saying, okay, I'm going to take out a piece of that. Now I'm going to do a whole other valuation of that piece, pretending I don't see the rest of that parcel. So in some cases, your land use change tax, if you sort of over time, which may be, part of the design, but if you over time withdraw portions, pay land use change tax and withdraw those portions, it might add up to more than if you just taken out the whole parcel. So one of the nice things about having a formula that is founded on the value of the enrolled acreage is that work has already been done. It's a formula that you can use to figure out what to do with your enrolled acreage, because that value has already been allocated for your property tax bill. If that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Is that, so when you figure out the value of the whole parcel, is that, and somebody takes out 2 acres and doing it the old way, or the way that page 134 suggests? At what point are you assessing the value of the entire property to use for that calculation? Is that when it was enrolled in current use?
Right, so
Or is it just the
not
current
looking-
assessed value?
Right, so if it's the entire parcel, whole kit and caboodle, you've only got forest land or you've only got ag land or something, no house or anything, then that value is already set, that's what's on the grand list, done. When you're under the prior and current, you've got the enrolled valuation, which is separate. So what is actually enrolled in current use. So under the prior formula, which is one of the ones being considered right now, if you take out a portion of that portion,
Yeah.
a portion of your enrolled acreage, it would be prorated. So if you took out, if you had 10 and you took out 2 or so on and so forth. And then that was what, like you took that value of the enrolled acreage and did a proration and hit with the 10%.
I guess my question is when do you decide what the value of the whole piece is that you're prorating off of?
The lister they set that when the process is landowner applies, we review it in current use. If it involves forest land, Forest Parks and Recreation review that. Okay, everyone agrees this is fine, this is eligible, it's approved. It goes to the lister or assessor to to basically apportion their property tax of what the value is of the enrolled acreage at that time. Because then you get your property tax bill based on that use value.
And then 20 years later, somebody decides I'm gonna take out 2 acres. What value do you use that on?
Highest and best use at that moment using the most recent CLA.
So it's information that you have, but it might have been done like a year before or something, but it's fairly recent value.
Right, right.
Yes.
Anything that we haven't covered yet?
For what it's worth, I'd want to talk a little bit more about the extending 30 days to 90 days.
Oh, yes, please.
For the process. So when you purchase property enrolled in the program, you file a property transfer tax return. That flags in our system and we send out a letter that says, hey, it looks like you just purchased property that's enrolled in the current use program. Or you just applied to enroll property and it looks like it's changed hands. So there's ways we sort of try to catch these, but those things happen over months. And so I worry about, and very much we send a 30-day letter and then we send another 30-day letter. Like nobody is not getting approved if they don't send us an application, which I hate to say out loud because I want people to follow, to get it to us as soon as they could reasonably. 90 days is a long window of time. And and I think that's kind of happening already just in the nature of how we're processing things. It takes us time and it takes landowners time. So we give folks plenty of time to say, yep, I did purchase property in the program. I've got to follow my steps. If they're actively working towards, working with Forest Parks and Recreation, if it's forest property, or if we can start to work on their application, we do that. We're always a little bit behind because there's just a high volume. But the concern happens if you talk to any lister, assessor, and town clerk, they do not like PBR in December because that is the end of the year and we are scrambling to wrap up current use and homestead stuff. And so to bump out anything further, I just worry that would further exacerbate the stress at the end of the year when the towns are trying to close out their grand list and we're sending them all kinds of stuff. We're already behind. So they're like, why this happened in September and you're just telling me now. So I just worry about 90 days is a long window. But as far as like how it works on a practical level, folks certainly do have more than 30 days to get that to us. I realize that's not necessarily reassuring or statutory, but 90 days is a long window to bump out something that ends up having a property tax impact. So I just would want a chance to talk about that a little bit more if that was all I had.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna camp out next year if that's.
Okay, good. Yes. Keep.
Tricia. She is.
Yeah, maybe. When did the agenda change? Tonight,
Yesterday, you were.
like that, but
Oh, well, we're glad you came
I
back.
was here at 7:20. I didn't see any notes. Rubbing shoulders with Gov. Now it's in the Senate transition.
Sorry.
Incoming.
Keith, do you need permission to get in?
When to be let in.
Catching an interruption.
You need that, when you shake those, Michelle.
Yeah, if there's gonna be something on the screen, that'd be great.
Just turn off the volume on your computer.
That's better.
So just.
Demi.
We had Keith and FPR in a couple of weeks back, I think, to just give us some early information on current use overview and was great for giving us some foundational knowledge. We then heard from tax department the last time. I think the tax department was in, and we were interested in what the administration position was, frankly, on these bills. And the tax department wanted to defer, you'll recall, to the agencies. So we did ask Keith to come back and share whatever you'd like to share. So thank you, Keith.
Great. Thank you. My name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. Grew up in Waterbury, been a forester since 2003, and been a private consultant for a while in Chittenden County Forester for a while before taking on this role in 2015. As I've mentioned at previous testimony, I've been working in current use for more than 20 years, and it's really an honor to work in this program, and I think it's really important for the state. So when we are doing evaluation of the bills that are getting proposed coming from FPR, we're really looking at, what is the cost to implement the proposal? What is the cost for landowners? What is the cost for FPR and our staff? And we are considering, because we interact with property valuation and review, what does that interaction look like? Certainly they will represent themselves on all of this stuff, but that's part of our picture. And then also really trying to figure out, how does it relate to the program purposes and working lands goals? As Jill mentioned, and as I testified previously, there's a lot of goals in this program, and it's a complex program. So there is a lot of push and pull as we turn knobs and pull levers in the program, and some efforts to solve one problem might exacerbate a problem in another area. And so that's just something I hope I can help consider. And so questions are examples of, does the change align with the goals of the landowner? If the program doesn't align with goals of landowners, they're not interested. And if they aren't interested, the program isn't going to meet its goals. Does the bill or proposal keep the land intact? And all of these things are going to occur by degrees. Some will be, yes, it maximizes intact land. Some of them, like 134, actually accepts subdivision parcelization in some respects. And in certain levels, that's inevitable in the state. And at some point, it might put the goals of the program out of balance. Does the proposal keep forests healthy and productive, or maintain the affordability of working lands? And so, touching on three main points today, the land use change tax is touched on in H 134 and 273. And land use change tax, we want it to be transparent, predictable, implementable, and we want it to be sufficiently high enough to incentivize and focus state investment on working lands. It takes a long time for the state to realize the benefit of working lands. If forest land is enrolled for 5 or even 10 years, it hasn't had much of an opportunity to realize and provide that return for the state. But it does have a cost for the state for land to be enrolled during that period. Not just in the hold harmless payments that get paid to the town, but also in the foregone revenue. If that land is not committed to be working lands and is instead excluded from enrollment, there will be a different tax applied to that, or a different income for the state. And so it's not just how much is going out, but how much foregone revenue comes from land being enrolled that might otherwise be removed from the program. And so a sufficiently high land use change tax can be a deterrent for somebody from enrolling land that they're not committed to managing as working lands. I say that with a qualifier that life happens and things change for people, and what they may commit to managing as working lands at some point, maybe a different approach makes sense. And so there is a balance to strike there, but it certainly requires a balance. So in 134, the proposal is going to the 10% pro rata, and that's where we were several years ago, or nearly where we were several years ago. It's transparent, it's predictable, it's implementable, it's easy. And so in many respects, it checks a lot of boxes, but it is a very low land use change tax. And if I'm a landowner and I'm thinking, I've got 2 acres out here, I kind of want to leave my options open. I could manage it for saw timber for a few years, and maybe I'll develop it. later. If the land use change tax is low, I'm enrolling it. And that is in my interest as a landowner. It may not be in the state's interest because the state is losing the potential income from that tax, and they're not realizing the benefit from the working lands. What I would like to be able to say as an employee of FPR is, hey, if you're not committed to managing this as forest land for saw timber and healthy forest, then hold it out for now. And then enroll it when you're really confident that you're going to be managing it for those goals. But with a low land use change tax, that may not make sense to do from a financial perspective. And so I think the 10% pro rata doesn't strike that right balance. In terms of H273 going to the 6% land use change tax, it perpetuates the existing framework, which we've already mentioned and Jill mentioned today, isn't transparent, predictable, or implementable. It's something that's worth fixing. The 6% threshold, at times that can be a pretty high land use change tax. And at times it's not that high. And so I think I don't know what the right fix is, but it does feel like if we're going to be working in the land use change tax area, the biggest win here is getting to the transparent, predictable, and implementable piece. And I think that's really important considering the affordable housing aspect of this. If somebody is trying to work through what can I do with this project and what's my total budget, they don't want to find out what it costs to pursue this project after they've pushed the rock down the hill and committed to it. They want to know ahead of time and figure out, how does this all pan out? And 273's land use change tax wouldn't support that outcome. So those are the general comments we've got for the land use change tax. I'll reiterate what Jill was saying in terms of the NRC's proposal. It does appear that it checks a lot of these boxes, more than either the existing land use change tax or those proposed in 134 or 273. With that said, like Jill, I think it really does require running some scenarios and understanding, does this strike the right balance in terms of something that's makes sense for landowners? Where does it work well? Where does it not work so well? And then we can evaluate it more deeply.
Representative Burke.
I think, so if we were to take the language that talked about prorating based on the current value of the whole parcel. If we combined from 134 and 273, if we took that from 134 and put it in 273, get rid of the 6% and do 10% of the value, based on proration of the whole piece, then that would get the transparent, predictable, and implementable part. Correct?
I'm not sure I'm following, but I think if we're saying it's 10% of the prorated, which is what 134 currently says.
Yes.
That is a very low penalty. And on a 100-acre parcel, that's $2,000 an acre. It might be $400 to remove 2 acres. Over just a few years of enrollment as a landowner, I think that's going to pan out for me to enroll it. If I just enroll that after a few years, long before the state has received its working lands benefits, I will be at a break-even point. The state will not have received the benefits, but it will have spent out money for its enrollment, and it will have foregone the potential revenue had it been held out of the program. And so I think that's just, the 10% is low. We walked away from that several years ago because of that. And so we would think it would be valuable. Can I add one more thing from an administrative standpoint? If somebody is choosing to enroll property that they then feel comfortable removing quickly, it adds to the administration of the program. The fluctuation of enrollments, the shifting in enrollments has additional administrative costs that they're a little bit harder to describe and point out, but
and we haven't really talked too much or tried to quantify that, but I think we have heard that the department's a little bit stretched just in terms of staffing to make sure that the current enrollees, and it's growing, are being monitored and that their plans are being adhered to.
we're processing, and Jill was, I think, illustrated this well. For every property, for every application that's approved, there are multiple scenarios that we are navigating. It's not just we get an application in and we say yes. We're getting calls of landowners who aren't even submitting an application that they're navigating. So it all just compounds. And some of those numbers we can report on, some of them we can't.
I do have a follow-up.
Yeah, just state your question, but so if I understand that current use would potentially lose out on receiving funds if it's easy and doesn't, there isn't much of a penalty for carving out a certain amount of acreage for development. But if a house is built on that, right, then the state actually gains a lot of tax income and the education fund. So it's not really a loss to the state for those types of developments to happen. It's a little bit, it's hard to extrapolate.
It is the
What
balance.
the effect on state income or loss would be based off of a penalty that's low for removing land from current
Yeah.
use. Current use would certainly lose that, so.
And I think that's the question for the committee. Are we focused on incentivizing working lands or removing disincentives for development, and how much of a disincentive for development is the land use change tax? And that's a hard question to answer, I think.
It's one follow-up that look based on like what you've been saying, Michelle, it's way more complicated than just seeing one piece of land, a 2-acre piece on a 100-acre piece come out and say, oh, we're failing working lands, because like you said, it might be an older couple that owns a big farmhouse and they're no longer working land, but there's a young family that wants to come in and work the land, but the old couple wants to stay on the land, right? Or we've heard testimony from if you are a disadvantaged low income person, you want to get into farming, you want to buy a piece of land, you need to build a house on that piece of land, you need to take a piece of that out of current use for that. Then if the penalty is too high, it's actually creating a blockage on that land getting worked. So I think there's a lot of complexity involved where you can't just say, oh, something got carved out of current use where the system is failing in terms of the the benefit of the working land in Vermont. I
Totally agree.
So from what I think we've heard there needs to be incentives to be able to build housing on land that is in current use in order to preserve working lands as well. I just want to make that statement.
Yes, Representative Nelson.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, as I understand it, current use has been kind of a stable number of acres enrolled in it over time. It hasn't fluctuated a lot.
I think it has only gone up since the beginning,
Since the beginning. Of course, it was started in 1978
around then.
and 3,000 dairy farms in the state then. Yeah.
You know better than I do.
Yeah, roughly. We're down to 400. So farming is, and a lot of that land still in enrollment's only gone up. Farms have changed size and shape and type a lot since 1978 when this was started. And, so there's more people needing to live on their land.
Mhm.
They're gonna farm it, you know, not real great to have to live in town and drive 5 miles to go to your 20 acres to work on it or whatnot.
Yeah.
But 134, the whole and I just reread it again, and I understand now what you're saying about the 10% rule. And you're right, that does lower the disincentive to keep it in current use by a lot. You know, if you value the whole, like we talked about earlier, 100-acre field being worth $2,000 an acre or $5,000 an acre. And you take out 2 acres, you know, it's only $1,000, you know, peanuts if you're someone that has a house lot. But 134 also, the main purpose of 134 is to allow a lot of farmland, some forest land are right contiguous to village centers or downtowns. And it's to be able to allow that land in 3 miles, it says 3 miles in there, and we've all come to realize that's way too broad a scope. We're looking at a quarter, half a mile. We're gonna look at that later on this afternoon, I believe, with the geological.
And we'll touch on that part of it
Yeah.
in a little bit.
Yeah, so it's to allow residential housing to be built. And those types of scenarios without penalty, so we can have more nurses and carpenters and plumbers and, you know, people living in the state to help offset our terrible demographics.
And I think the balancing act of all of this is so important, and I so appreciate the importance of having the opportunity to build a home on land that kids might take care of, and as we're talking about farmland and the importance of this, keeping in perspective that the program has 550,000 acres of agricultural land and 2 million acres of forest land. And the rationale for that home siting associated with the land on farmland might be different than on forest land, but whatever approach gets taken, unless it's a bit more surgical, is going to apply to all of it. And the risk of fragmentation in forest land is something that we've seen play out across the landscape. This is, as a clear purpose of the program, is to plan for the state's orderly growth. We've seen other states like Connecticut and Massachusetts where there's not big blocks of forest in the same way like there is in Vermont. And we would love to hold on to that intact forest land and expand our housing. And how do we do it and get a win-win outcome without blowing the barn doors open is the needle. I think we're all trying to thread that, but I want to make sure that there's really strong reasons to consider this on farmland because of the requirement to actively manage it, the co-location of housing with farming and agriculture, and recognizing that might play out differently in some cases, not all, but some cases than forest land, trying to understand what the right approach would be given the differences. Would it make sense to take the next step? Or do you want to stay on here?
You know, I think maybe we should go ahead, unless you've got something, a question, Representative Lipsky. If it's just a comment, let's save comments. But if we've got questions for Keith on this slide, anybody?
Pass to the
Okay.
next topic.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman.
Regarding the income eligibility threshold, this isn't one that FPR would ever actually take the lead on. And the Agency of Ag and PBR should lead on this. But because we work with farmers a lot, we do recognize the increasing need to diversify income to hold land and keep farming. And so I think that we we see that there could be value in that. And as we say that, we also recognize it'll affect enrollment and administration, so that affects PVR. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. One thing that if this does move forward, there is something that maybe could be considered, and because income is based on being designated a farmer, verified as a farmer is based on farm income. There are times when somebody will make income from harvesting wood consistent with a forest management plan that, because of the language in statute, that is not farm income. And if somebody's on the cusp of that threshold and they get income from harvesting wood, they could actually lose eligibility as a farmer because they implemented their forest management plan. It's very rare. It requires some certain timing for even that to be evaluated, but the fact that it could ever occur is unfortunate. And if something like this moves forward, we'd recommend some version of this. And we've mentioned this to Jill, that when verifying farmer by income, that the income from the forest management under an approved plan should either be treated as agricultural income or excluded from income calculations. And that would help avoid that unfortunate, rare, but unfortunate circumstance.
You always wanted to be a farmer, didn't you?
I did. I'm what I always wanted to be. Not a farmer.
In terms of the affordable housing exemption, we conceptually support the exemption and have acknowledged additional refinements are needed to streamline the administration and balance with working lands goals. I think in the next few slides, I mostly raise questions, and some of these could be addressed pretty easily. I think there's already work to consider them, but and Jill raised this. The exemption applies when affordable, if the withdrawal is for affordable housing. When and how does the withdrawal for affordable housing get demonstrated? As a landowner, I need to understand how far down the process do I need to get before I can qualify for the exemption. And yet I need to be withdrawing the land before any action has taken, before any development occurs. And so I think that's a question of timing and order of operations that landowners, foresters, and PBR and others will need to navigate and understand. I think in terms of balancing with the working lands goals, withdrawing land for housing makes sense, but how much land is exempted from the land use change tax? How much land are we withdrawing when affordable housing is being developed? Is it 2 acres per dwelling or 100 acres?
Senator Boston.
Yeah, I've been talking to Ledge Council about working on this idea as an amendment, and it hasn't been, I think, shared with the full committee yet. But I think what we're looking at this point would be 1 acre and 1 property per half acre. So potentially you could have 2 dwellings built on 1 acre, and only 1 landowner would be able to do that. So it wouldn't be 100 acres and 100 dwellings. It would be very limited, and kind of the example that Greg was talking about, where you have an existing farmhouse, you want to build 1 or 2 more properties, either for workforce or for aging farmers or for children of farmers, but trying to preserve the farm community and the workforce in the farm community on a very, very limited basis. So, I mean, yesterday we were talking about 2 acres, and I talked to someone today, I think we actually would change that to 1 acre, but we're thinking small, very small and very limited.
Are you thinking, or maybe it's.
I mean, we need to talk as a committee before we go too far. I just wanted to sort of answer, because we have been talking about that a little bit on the sides, but we haven't had a chance to fully process.
So let's, what we can say for conversation, committee conversation. I want to be sure we get through Keith's presentation.
And then the clarity on how there's language that says the withdrawal does not result in fragmentation of an existing parcel. It's not clear to me how withdrawal from use value appraisal fragments a parcel? Are we talking it doesn't subdivide it or it doesn't create a physical alteration? If the goal is to minimize fragmentation of forest land, that's consistent with the purposes, but the question of how does that get evaluated? Who evaluates that and when is important? And if it's subdivision of a parcel, that seems inherent to building housing. It seems like that's a necessary outcome of creating housing. And so we need to figure that out for folks. And then finally, in terms of where this would be eligible, we've already acknowledged that the 3-mile limit is too far. And because that wouldn't be in balance with the working lands goals. And we think that aligning the exemption with targeted growth areas would be valuable, considering using the Act 250 Tier 1 growth areas, the updated regional plans by December 31st, 2026. And I don't know, I'm not in tune with these growth areas as much, but Danny's thought about it a fair bit. So if there are any questions related to that, I can bring her up as well. But that's the end of the testimony we've got. We've tried to focus on things that we thought were most in play. If there are other questions related to some of the other bills they'd like to discuss, we have been considering those as well, but thought you want to focus on this stuff.
We might want to invite Commissioner Fisco up before we do. Did the other bill that has to do with posted land?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you have any slides on it,
I
but
don't have any slides on it.
thoughts that were.
Yeah, I think that this would be one of the most significant changes to the program that's occurred in terms of reducing the use value appraisal, the use value rate that landowners are receiving. And the posting of land, I'm a hunter, deer browse creates challenges for regeneration. We want people to have access to forest land. I want as little posted land as possible. And yet, the purpose of the program is to maintaining the working landscape. That can occur all when land is posted. And to create a very significant change for the program based on a condition that's not fundamental to the success of the program or a parcel's ability to contribute to the working lands goals. I think there are some problems with that. I also think it could create a real administrative challenge. Right now, there isn't a public entitlement or opportunity or expectation of access to privately owned land enrolled in use value appraisal. And when there is, there's going to be a lot of confusion to navigate for folks who aren't even enrolled in the program, but understanding what their expectations are. And then we're going to be responding to a lot of complaints about enforcement and misunderstandings that will require responses. And I'm concerned that stretched thin, we're going to be moving from walking with a landowner talking about how to manage their forest land to evaluating posted signs on parcels and considering whether or not they are consistent with the use value rate that they're receiving. So this has come up a number of times. There are many good reasons that landowners post land for safety reasons, for experiences in the past, or because it's being hunted intensively by others already who have permission. And so adding this on to the program and administration and potentially undermining the affordability aspects of the program, I think may not be in balance with the purposes.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And Commissioner Fisco, was there anything that you wanted to add? Or if you'd like to come up to the
Sure,
table, if there are questions that maybe you can help with.
sure. For the record, Danielle Fitzko, I'm Commissioner for Parks and Recreation. I don't have much more to add. I do just want to share that I want you to have full access to Keith. Because he has been doing this, as you've heard, for 10 years. He thinks a lot about this program. He loves the program and really knowledgeable about the intricacies and the complexities of this program. I also just wanted to thank you for really taking the time here with evaluating UVA. I think we could all agree how important this program is to the state. It's keeping working lands working. It's also a huge conservation program. I don't think we'd have the Vermont we see today if we did not have UVA started in 1978. I also am recognizing when I'm hearing the conversation, there's a lot of ag focus. I really appreciate what Keith brought up the forestry lens here, because it really, with 2 million acres enrolled, and when we're talking about development, we've talked about forest fragmentations for years, and how do we, keep check on that, because we value not only the benefits, the ecological benefits, but the social and economic benefits of working forest. And maybe a little bit different than ag is that maybe you can actively manage 10 acres, 5 acres for ag, but working forest land is different. In order to be operable, you need to have larger areas to make it worthwhile. So just keeping that kind of context in mind as you're going forward. In relation to thinking about the Act 250 sort of growth areas, I'm glad you're going to hear from VCIG and regional planning commissions, because they are really thinking about land use at a statewide, town level, regional level, and where growth should be focused. Those smart growth principles where we're dense downtowns and our rural working areas, and those areas where we really want to incentivize affordable housing, where we maybe it's not just 1 or 2 houses, where we want 50 units on a parcel. That's where towns are working with regional planning commissions to identify where those areas are. So they make sense from a forest perspective to concentrate growth. But I also understand, people's land ownerships and wanting to also support, passing it on and what that looks like. And so you're at a crossroads here of where to go next. And there could be a difference between ag and forestry. I don't know. But I'm grateful for the time you're taking, because I think as Keith and Jill mentioned, we've heard before, any little changes to this program can have some real unintended consequences. And I don't recognize how complex it is until I ask Keith a question and I'm like, oh my gosh. So I just full access to Keith on all forestry related stuff. His team worked hard on this. And I think we know it's working, but we all need to be thinking about the future, and there's always improvements to be made. That's kind of all I had to say, because you're going to probably ask questions and I'm just pass it to Keith. But
Well, if that's all right, Keith, Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, funny you mention that, Danny, because I'm really thinking about Keith, and like everything you described, it's incredibly successful. But Keith, maybe this is a question for you. We have an incredible exodus of young Vermonters from our state. Don't have a place to live. They went to high school, grade school, grew up, but they're leaving the state. We have a workforce crisis that's going to make Vermont unsustainable. And so the word affordability is one thing, but we need entry-level access. And then, with all due respect, and Keith both, all due respect to the goals of the Tier 1 growth areas, there's a vast amount of rural Vermont that don't have municipal water, municipal sewer, don't have a town center, or if they did, it got washed away in one of the last floods in the last dozen years. We need to make sure that those Vermont families can still live here and be part of our economy. So we have no hostility toward the current use, none. We value it just like you. But we have a responsibility. We're not in a bubble, even though we're in this building. We go back to our rural towns and know the crisis and the hardship that families, whether it's the National Guard, the fire department, the school staff, the highway departments, these folks are leaving Vermont. And this is a crisis way beyond a slight fragmentation of ag land. Of course, we don't fragment forest land. I mean, but I think I'm looking to you as the expert I know. And I'd love counsel on how this big crisis that we as a state are facing, and it's imminent, we're in it, and we've been in it. We're just now getting the ground. So I'd like,
I'm not gonna
counsel from
let
you.
Keith off the hook necessarily, but I will say that we chatted for a few moments beforehand, and I said, we're getting deep into an area that many of us are passionate about. We're passionate about all of this. But we're getting into an area that we don't necessarily know as much about as other people do in building housing. And Keith said, yeah, he would say the same thing. So
Yeah, this is one area, these Act 250 tier 1 growth areas are one overlay that there doesn't need to be, we don't need to reinvent the wheel for. And maybe it's insufficient, and maybe there are other areas, but the goal being that there is an alignment between the exemptions for land use change tax that and use value appraisal that align with the state's growth goals, where it occurs, how it occurs, et cetera. And maybe these areas are insufficient and they don't address the rural opportunities, and maybe another opportunity needs to be added in. But creating that consistency and predictability and not opening it wide open is what we think would be supportive, because again, it's the balance between, yes, we want housing, and yes, we want intact forest land. We can do both. How do we do it?
this has been a great conversation, and I think we should take a break. We will. We will not be taking a lunch break, or some of us won't be. You can have a lunch break. The committee will formally be having a lunch break. But I want to say we're going to get right back into this. We have a couple of other things that we're going to look at, just because we have other bills that we're trying to also take some action on. But thank you, Keith. Really appreciate it. I think it was very helpful. Jill, thank you again.
Thank you.
For coming in. Let's take a break. Let's